Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us for today's program, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through our Facebook or YouTube channels, and a special welcome to our C-SPAN audience. Before we hear from Katherine Marino about her new book, Feminism and the Americas, the Making of an International Human Rights Movement, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the next couple of days. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., we'll have a special preview screening of a new documentary entitled Joseph Pulitzer, Voice of the People. The film is part of PBS's American Masters series. And following the screening, filmmaker Orrin Rudavsky and novelist Nicholson Baker will discuss the film. On Thursday, March 28th at 7 p.m., former FCC Commissioner Tom Wheeler will tell us about his new book, From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future, which brings to life the two great network revolutions of the past and uses them to help put in perspective the confusion, uncertainty, and even excitement most people face today. Check our website at archives.gov or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. Visit its website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about the foundation. Next month, on May 10th, we will open our new exhibit upstairs in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote, uses National Archives records to tell the story of women's struggles for voting rights as a critical step towards equal citizenship. The 19th Amendment is rightly celebrated as a major milestone. It is just one critical piece of the larger story of women's battles for the vote. Rightfully Hers and a companion traveling exhibit, One Half of the People, will explore how American women across the spectra of race, ethnicity, and class advanced the cause of suffrage. It will follow the struggle of voting rights beyond 1920. While this centennial focuses our attention on women in the United States, it also gives us the opportunity to discover the women's rights movements in other nations. Katherine Marino's new book, Feminism for the Americas, reminds us that that struggle for women's rights was a global movement. Katherine M. Marino is an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she is an affiliated faculty member of the Latin American Studies Department. Her research and teaching interests include 20th century U.S. and Latin American history, histories of women, gender, sexuality, and race in the Americas, human rights, and transnational feminism. Her book, Feminism for the Americas, is based on her dissertation, which won the 2014 Organization of American Historians Lerner Scott Prize for the best dissertation on U.S. women's history. And I'm pleased to report that her dissertation was made possible by the extensive use of National Archives resources, records of the State Department, Department of Labor, the Women's Bureau, and records of international conferences, commissions, and expositions, as well as two papers collections at the FDR Library in Hyde Park. Her writing has also appeared in the Journal of Women's History, Frontiers, a Journal of Women's Studies, Gender and History, and the San Francisco Chronicle, and La Prensa of Panama City, among other publications. She's appeared on the podcast Origins, Current Events in Historical Perspective, and Human Rights in Transit. Her work has received support from national organizations, including the Mellon Foundation, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Katherine Marino.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thanks so much to Douglas Swanson and everyone at the National Archives for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here today. My book, Feminism for the Americas, tells the history of Pan-American feminism. This was a movement that over the first half of the 20th century united women's rights leaders and organizations from throughout the Americas to push for international standards in women's rights. Their activism paved the way in various countries for legislation like women's suffrage, for civil rights for married women like guardianship rights over their children, property rights, independent nationality rights, and also for economic and social rights like state-sponsored maternity leave and child care policies. Like any major social movement, Pan-American feminism was characterized by great collaboration as well as by great conflict. Feminists intensely debated how to define feminism and who had the authority to do so. Unsurprisingly, heated conflicts emerged over U.S. empire and also over U.S. imperial feminism. In this movement, Latin American feministas increasingly banded together, creating their own inter-American groups and pushing their own broader agendas that often addressed multiple forms of inequality. These mobilizations led to concrete victories. And my book argues that this movement was so effective, not in spite of these conflicts and debates, but actually because of them. Today, I'm going to be talking about a significant conflict that emerged between two pivotal feminist leaders, Doris Stevens from the United States on the right, and Ofelia Dominguez Navarro from Cuba on the left. For a decade, Doris Stevens chaired the Inter-American Commission of Women. This was a group that gave organizational form to Pan-American feminism in these years. And although Ofelia Dominguez Navarro helped create this commission, increasingly she viewed Stevens' definition of feminism as too narrow and also her leadership over it unilateral. Their conflict would ultimately expand far beyond the two of them and actually help broaden the movement's goals. Before getting into their story, I want to say a few words first about the broader historical significance of Pan-American feminism and also my own approach to it. What distinguishes Pan-American feminism from other forms of international feminist organizing in Europe and other parts of the world at this time was that it was actually innovating new forms of international law that then directly laid the groundwork for international human rights in the post-war period. In the 1920s, Pan-American feminists created what was the first intergovernmental organization to push for women's rights in the world. This was the Inter-American Commission of Women. And that commission took up an equal rights treaty that long before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights existed, was itself a proto-human rights treaty. The movement's activism culminated at the 1945 San Francisco conference that created the United Nations. And there it was a group of Latin American feminists, all of whom had cut their teeth on decades of Pan-American feminist organizing, including the Brazilian feminist Berta Lutz, pictured here, who were the ones responsible for pushing women's rights into the United Nations founding charter and into its definition of human rights. They also proposed what became the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. It's important to note that at this conference, these Latin American feminists achieved these goals over the express objections of the US and British women who were also at this conference, who deemed women's rights either not important enough or too divisive to include into the UN Charter at this moment. So the history of this movement really challenges some fundamental narratives that we have about feminist history, namely that it was invented in the United States and Western Europe and then exported elsewhere. In fact, my book argues that Latin American feminisms were in the vanguard of global feminism and international human rights. These feministas were drawing on a much longer tradition of regional multilateralism that had thrived in the Spanish Americas since the 19th century independence movements. In the early 20th century, a revived Pan-Americanism was flourishing, particularly after the First World War shattered ideals of European global cultural superiority. Now, the new nations of the Americas embraced a role of global leaders, inspiring a host of new Pan-American institutions, publications, and standards in hygiene and welfare reform, in international law, and in women's rights. This was the context necessary for Pan-American feminism to emerge, but the movement only thrived because of a group of determined feminist activists who drove it. And my book focuses on 6 remarkable leaders: Berta Lutz from Brazil, Ofelia Dominguez Navarro from Cuba, Paulina Luisi from Uruguay, Marta Vergara from Chile, Doris Stevens from the United States, and Clara Gonzalez from Panama. History has tended to remember these women for their significant national contributions. Many of them were the founders of some of their country's first official feminist organizations, and they were trailblazers in other ways. Paulina Luisi, for instance, was the first female doctor in Uruguay, and Clara Gonzalez was the first female lawyer in Panama. But they were also connected to each other internationally, and they formed a dense network. The lines here demonstrate relationships that I uncovered through either correspondence or meetings in person. And I did research in almost all of their archives and in foreign relations archives in most of these countries as well. They all participated in inter-American conferences, which is key to defining these women as a group, distinguishing them as a group. They all had the racial and class privilege, as well as the educational pedigrees and personal connections to gain entree into elite international spaces. The Latin American women were all deemed white or mestiza in their national contexts, even if they were not deemed white by their US counterparts. They also shared other traits. Most of these women were single, and none of them had children, which enabled them to devote their lives to their activism. They were also quite heterogeneous politically, and they offer really rich portals into a wide variety of different kinds of feminist thought at this time. For instance, Ofelia Dominguez Navarro and Marta Vergara both became communists. Paulina Luisi and Clara Gonzalez were both socialists but not communists, and Berta Lutz and Doris Stevens were very much liberal feminists. Lutz had a particularly idiosyncratic approach to Pan-Americanism. She believed that Brazil should lead the way and believed that Portuguese-speaking Latin Americans were superior to Spanish-speaking Latin Americans, which caused conflicts between her and various groups of women. And yet, the dynamics of inter-American feminism caused Latin American feminists of different political stripes to unite with each other and to promote their own leadership. In the process, they broadened their agenda far beyond that of their US counterparts in a few critical ways. First, they demanded social and economic, as well as civil and political rights. Second, they often connected women's rights to other movements, such as those against imperialism, and in the 1930s and 40s, movements against fascism and against racism. Finally, they believed that their movement itself should be structured along egalitarian lines, and they privileged Latin American leadership. Dominguez Navarro's conflict with Stevens, who led the commission for a decade, would be critical to amplifying these goals and uniting women throughout the Americas around them. So now on to their story. Ofelia Dominguez Navarro was born in 1894 in Las Villas, Cuba, and she grew up amidst the revolutionary fervor of the Cuban War for Independence and the Spanish-American War. Her father was an independence fighter who was twice arrested by the Spanish and exiled to Mexico. Over the course of her young life, Dominguez witnessed Cuba's autonomy erode while US military and political control over the island grew. Working as a school teacher in a rural part of Cuba, she drew connections between the US State Department and local elites in Cuba, US corporations, and impoverished laborers. She became a lawyer and a criminal attorney for destitute women and prostitutes, and it was through this work that she became involved in the liberal feminist movement that was growing in Cuba at the time. This is a picture of Dominguez in the center in a 1925 National Congress of Women, where she was part of a group called Club Femenino that was pushing for suffrage. She was already making waves at this time by insisting for the rights of illegitimate children and their mothers. This was a common concern of Latin American feminists. In many parts of Latin America, formal marriages were less common, and children born out of wedlock were deprived of many rights. She called herself a socialist feminist. Doris Stevens, 6 years older than Dominguez, was born in 1888 in Omaha, Nebraska, and attended Oberlin College. By the time she graduated from college in 1911, she was already deeply involved in the US suffrage movement. And she's pictured here with a group of women in the 1913 suffrage parade. This was actually the first organized march on Washington for political purposes. Alongside Alice Paul, Doris Stevens became a leader and a co-founder of the militant wing of the suffrage movement, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which was later renamed the National Women's Party. Stevens became famous in the US for publishing a book about her and other suffragists' imprisonment for picketing the White House in 1917 called Jailed for Freedom. In the 1920s, after passage of the suffrage amendment, Stevens began to focus on international work. Dominguez and Stevens first met each other when they and a number of other US and Cuban feminists essentially gatecrashed the 6th Pan American Conference in 1928 in Havana, Cuba, to demand women's rights. During this gathering of statesmen from the Americas, feminists from the US and Cuba held mass meetings like the one shown here. And Doris Stevens is pictured at the front of the room with other US feminists and Cuban feminists. There are a US flag and a Cuban flag hanging behind them, and there are about 200 people in attendance at this meeting. These feminists even marched in the streets of Havana, and they ultimately gained a hearing at the plenary of the conference, where they demanded the creation of the Inter-American Commission of Women. They were successful, and the Pan American Union established this commission to include 21 women, one from each republic of the Western Hemisphere, to study and promote women's rights on a hemispheric scale. Because of Stevens' leadership in Havana, they appointed her as the chair. And this is an image of the first members of the Inter-American Commission of Women in the courtyard of the Pan American Union, which is today the Organization of American States, just down the road here. Dominguez initially had high hopes for the commission, in part because one of her close friends, the Panamanian feminist leader Clara Gonzalez, was appointed as one of its first commissioners. Clara Gonzalez and Dominguez had met just a few years before at an Inter-American Congress of Women in Panama, where they had collaborated on a feminist agenda of their own. Here's a picture of that conference. First, they sought an international law which would grant absolute, equal civil and political rights for women throughout the Americas. Second, they desired social and economic rights for working mothers and for children, including state-sponsored maternity legislation for working women and elimination of discrimination against illegitimate children. Third, they wanted a hemispheric commitment to working against U.S. empire wherever it existed, whether that be in their own countries of Panama and Cuba, or elsewhere in the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, or in Nicaragua. During a time of pronounced U.S. political, economic, and military intervention in these countries and others, anti-imperialist movements were on the rise in Latin America, and many Latin American feminists deemed anti-imperialism to be a key part of their feminism. Gonzalez and Dominguez called for women's sovereignty and for national sovereignty as mutually constitutive goals. At the 1928 Havana Conference, Dominguez and other Cuban feminists had, to their own surprise, actually been won over by Doris Stevens and the other U.S. National Women's Party members who were there because they appeared aligned with these goals. Doris Stevens and her fellow Women's Party members were very careful to approach Cuban women not as teachers but as sisters. Stevens, for instance, insisted that U.S. women were just as victimized by lack of rights as Cuban women were, and she urged Cuban women to help them gain their rights in the United States. This conference was also taking place at a time when U.S. Marines were dive bombing Nicaragua to rout out the rebel groups of Augusto Sandino, and the Women's Party members made known that they sided with Sandino. Stevens proclaimed that neither women nor nations should be denied sovereignty. She used this anti-imperialist rhetoric to call for an equal rights treaty, an international treaty for women's political and civil rights, drafted by the Women's Party, that was very similar to that which Gonzalez and Dominguez had called for just 2 years earlier. Once Stevens became the chair of the commission, however, Dominguez and other Latin American feminists quickly realized that her utilization of anti-imperialist rhetoric was instrumental. She used it strategically, only when it helped garner Latin American support for the Commission's goals at these conferences. As chair, she had only really one concern, and that was sex equality, which meant to her the Equal Rights Treaty and another treaty that the Women's Party had drafted called the Equal Nationality Treaty, and this treaty would grant married women independent nationality rights. These equal rights treaties represented the international extensions of the U.S. National Women's Party's Domestic Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. The ERA, a bold constitutional guarantee of equal rights under the law, regardless of sex, had been languishing in U.S. Congress since the National Women's Party had gotten it introduced in 1923. The Women's Party saw their international activism around these treaties, which they then pushed into the Pan-American Union meetings and into the League of Nations with the help of Latin American feminists, as key to reviving their ERA at home. For Stevens and other Women's Party members, equal political and civil rights under the law represented the end-all goals of feminism. In these years, though, the ERA was dividing a formerly united swath of progressive women's groups that had been formerly working together in the fight for suffrage. Many working women and progressive reformers actually opposed the ERA because they feared it would abolish hard-fought special protective labor legislation for working women, things like hours laws and protecting them from harsh conditions of work. The ERA was also not taken up by other progressive groups, including those that fought for racial justice, in large part because the National Women's Party never defended African American civil rights. And they even allied with Southern congressmen who opposed anti-lynching legislation in exchange for their support for the ERA. The word feminist in the United States in these years came to be redefined almost exclusively around this single-issue equal rights under the law approach, and it came to describe ERA supporters, a small group of white, middle-class to affluent, educated women in the National Women's Party. This narrow vision for feminism greatly disappointed most of the Latin American feminists who worked with the Commission. What disappointed them even more was Stevens' exclusion of Latin American feminists who disagreed with her. Clara Gonzalez, the first appointee of the Commission from Panama, came to identify Stevens' control over funding as key to broader exclusion. Since the Pan-American Union and the U.S. government did not fund the Commission, Stevens raised money from wealthy U.S. donors and later from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. She used this money at her own discretion, paying for her own trips around the world to promote women's rights at various conferences where she often stayed at lavish hotels. She only rarely, though, offered Latin American commissioners any money for their travel to conferences, urging them instead to get money from their own governments, which most could not do. This was the case for Clara Gonzalez, who never had the funding made available to her to travel to any of the really major conferences, in spite of the fact that she actually did a great deal of the legal work that was necessary to create a huge compendium of laws that the Commission then promoted at these conferences. Stevens knew that Gonzalez's and many Latin American feminist priorities differed from her own, and she also firmly believed that as the veteran of a successful U.S. suffrage movement, she, Stevens, was the rightful leader for feminism in the Americas. This belief was reinforced by Stevens' own sense of racial and cultural superiority over Latin American women that she only explicitly betrayed to U.S. friends. The person who had challenged Stevens most publicly on these issues was Gonzalez's good friend, Ofelia Dominguez Navarro, who met Stevens again in 1930 when the Commission had their first official meeting in Havana. At this time, the 1929 global worldwide depression had contributed to the newly repressive regime of Gerardo Machado, supported by the U.S. government. By 1930, Dominguez and many other Cubans resented their country's combined state of depression and oligarchic tyranny. At a luncheon that Dominguez's feminist group hosted to welcome Stevens and Commission members, Dominguez urged the Commission to address women's economic and social rights as a top priority during this moment of national and international crisis. Dominguez, however, was dismayed to find that Stevens did not heed these concerns in the conference over the next few days, and that Stevens ran the organization more unilaterally, more broadly. Dominguez gained these insights from her friend Clara Gonzalez, who had come for the conference, and from Aida Parada, a Chilean primary school teacher and feminist who had just become the Chilean commissioner. In the business meeting, limited to the appointed commissioners in Havana, Gonzalez and Parada together sought to broaden its focus, and they called attention to the fact that although 2 years had passed since the commission had been founded, only 11 of the 21 commissioners had been named. And they pointed out that most of those 11 commissioners were actually the wives, sisters, and other relatives of Latin American statesmen and not active feminists. Lack of funding, they pointed out, made it virtually impossible for those feminists who had been appointed to spend any meaningful time in the Washington, D.C. headquarters. To enhance Latin American women's involvement, Gonzalez and Parada suggested that all national governments and the Pan American Union contribute financially. And here is an image of this business meeting in which these demands were made. Aida Parada is sitting all the way to the left, and Claire Gonzalez is here at the right, and Doris Stevens is, of course, at the head of the table. Stevens rejected all of these ideas. Angry at their attempts to embarrass her by pointing out how few women had been named, she also urged the women present to never publicly criticize the commission, explicitly calling for loyalty. She instructed them, quote, "Remember each time you are speaking that you are pleased to be here, that you are honored to have been appointed. Do not tell the world how slowly 21 countries moved. Please do not emphasize our faults. In other words, say that it is perfectly wonderful. It is." Stevens also discarded Gonzalez's suggestion that Dominguez, as a feminist lawyer, examine the rules of procedure for their meeting, also in the hopes of expanding the agenda of what was discussed. The conference proceeded without so much as a reference to the Great Depression or to the political turmoil in Cuba. Stevens even proclaimed Machado, who had sponsored the event, a, quote, feminist president, which angered many, including Dominguez. Stevens would actually go on to forge alliances with other dictators in the region who gave lip service to the equal rights treaties. She justified these relationships by saying that women's equal rights was a pure issue that was separate from politics. But for Gonzalez, Dominguez, and Parada, who all became good friends during this conference, feminismo was never separate from politics. And this is a picture of the three of them together taken by a Havana newspaper. These women believed that anti-imperialism, economic equity, and social justice must all be central goals of feminism. Dominguez made these views explicit in a newspaper interview she gave following the conference. In a profile entitled, "The Latin Americans Enjoyed the Role of Extras in the Recent Conference of Women," Dominguez explained that Stevens had decisively excluded Latin American women from the conference proceedings and from the commission itself. Dominguez explained that Gonzalez and Parada's efforts to raise these issues and others had been quashed by Stevens. While Dominguez praised Stevens's tenacity as a women's rights leader, she explained that, quote, "Whenever an idea that is contrary to Stevens's convictions is presented, the spirit of her race speaks through her mouth, and her gentle phrase and ample smile are substituted with imperious action and arbitrary imposition of her own agenda." No organization run on such unequal dynamics could ever represent the true, quote, equal rights of Latin American women, Dominguez argued. She further explained, "Working under the direction of women from North America demonstrates once again our condition of being a subject people to the empire of strength, to treaties enforced upon us." Dominguez's interview ended with a call for Latin American women to create their own movement. Quote, "I believe that all efforts carried on as Latin Americans or as women of our own countries will finally be more useful to our ultimate goals than lending our cooperation to these congresses." Soon after this interview, Dominguez actually split from her own liberal feminist group in Cuba and founded a new organization distinguished by its collaboration with working women, the Unión Laborista de Mujeres. This group deemed poverty, gender exploitation, and North American capitalist imperialism as the sources of women's oppression. Their letterhead included their motto that distinguished them from the Inter-American Commission of Women. "Before international law, we will fight for peace and for the social rights of working women. Before domestic law, for the civil equality and right of suffrage without any restrictions or limitations." The goals of Dominguez's group would change over the following years as the Machado dictatorship, still bolstered by the U.S., ushered in a new and protracted period of repression. Machado replaced civilian political administrators and mayors with military supervisors and increasingly relied on secret police to stamp out the mounting opposition. Feminists like Dominguez formed a key part of the resistance, and she and other members of her group were jailed for rebellion against the government. During this time, Dominguez worked toward her goal of an inter-American feminism led by Spanish-speaking women around those broader goals that she had mentioned. she reached out to the Uruguayan feminist Paulina Luisi, who is well known throughout the region as a continental feminist leader. The two started a correspondence and friendship that would last their whole lifetimes. They bonded over their shared definition of inter-American feminism, one defined more by international solidarity around local needs rather than by top-down treaties. Dominguez's second jail term in 1931 radicalized her, and she began to tap more explicitly into Marxist ideologies. And here's an image of her in a women's jail cell in 1932. She still cared deeply about confronting the inequalities that women faced, but now, as she wrote to her friend Luisi, during this time of revolution, she and her group were turning away from suffrage as a goal. They began to attach themselves more closely to a Latin American class struggle over the Cuban dictatorship and over all US-dominated structures of power in the Americas. Dominguez believed that women had a special charge to do this. As she wrote in one letter to Luisi, "We women will jolt our continent." Dominguez then became absolutely incensed when she received a letter from Doris Stevens later that year that implied that her organization was setting back progress for Cuban women by not pushing for suffrage. Instead of expressing empathy for Dominguez, whom she knew had been in jail, Stevens' message to Dominguez was terse, and it directed her to look to US suffragists as role models. Specifically, Stevens told Dominguez to employ their strategy of appealing to all men in political power, regardless of whether they characterized the Cuban Revolution as a, quote, somewhat hysterical civic crisis. And this angered even the liberal feminists in Cuba who were working in collaboration with the Commission. Dominguez wrote Stevens a long and fiery response. During a time when martial law reigned, when all universities and schools were of law, not just ours as women, but of an entire people deprived of liberty. To Stevens' suggestion that Dominguez look to US suffragists as role models, Dominguez responded that she would not follow Stevens' quote, rules, which would, quote, result in disaster. Furthermore, she wrote, she, quote, could not stand the idea of lowering oneself to beg for that which she has the right to demand. She paraphrased Cuban revolutionary Jose Marti, quote, rights should not be begged for, rights are to be taken. Dominguez's letter was a goodbye to Doris Stevens, with whom she would never correspond again, but she also turned it into a call to arms to other Latin American feminists. Dominguez reproduced Stevens' note to her along with her long response as a flyer, one page front and back. And here's an image of that broadside that was on her organization's letterhead. She titled it, To the Political Conscience of Latin American Women, and her group sent this flyer out to numerous groups throughout the Americas, which really looked to Dominguez also as a continental feminist leader. This flyer was an influential act of resistance. It amplified a common frustration of many Latin American feminists with Stevens' unilateral leadership and narrow vision, and it inspired new alternative forms of inter-American organizing. When Dominguez sent this flyer to a group of Argentinian feminists, she urged them to form a new group that, as she wrote, would, quote, deal broadly with all of the political, social, and economic topics of great interest and influence to humanity today. Several years later, those Argentinian feminists did create a group that embraced multiple goals: social and economic rights, anti-fascism, peace, anti-imperialism, and that did link feminist groups from throughout the Americas. Dominguez's group later called this flyer one of their most important anti-imperialist fights to date. Its effects were significant. The group that Argentinian feminists formed, along with other friends of Dominguez from Cuba and Mexico, would be instrumental in ultimately pushing Stevens out of her decade-long position as the chair of the commission and replacing her at last with a Latin American woman, a feminist from Argentina. But Dominguez's flyer and the activism it galvanized also helped broaden the movement and make it more relevant to wide swaths of people. It coincided with the emergence of a large transnational popular front movement in the mid-1930s that had grown in response to the rise of global fascism, and that pushed Pan-American feminism to a new stage, what I call Popular Front Pan-American feminism. This was a Latin American-led feminism that combined socialist labor concerns with equal rights demands for women in the context of an anti-fascist and anti-imperialist inter-American solidarity. The Popular Front, the Communist Party's call for an anti-fascist collaboration between communists and social democrats, was extremely influential in Latin America. It gained governmental power in Chile and in Mexico, and it functioned as a social movement that often turned into an electoral coalition of political parties in numerous Latin American countries, especially those where right-wing governments, reminiscent of European fascism, were taking power. These Frente Popular groups had transnational links with each other and common goals, including support for the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War, Puerto Rican nationalism, and nationalization of Mexican oil, and because of the power of inter-American feminism, women's rights. The Popular Front worked in synergy with and galvanized new inter-American feminist activism, particularly when right-wing governments throughout the world were systematically stripping women, especially working women, of their rights. This slide shows just some of the many new anti-fascist feminist groups that emerged in Latin America between 1934 and the 1940s. Together, these groups were also connecting with each other, and collectively, they pushed women's social and economic rights to the center of the inter-American feminist agenda. They continued working with the Inter-American Commission of Women in recognition of the prestige and power that the Commission had and of the utility of these equal rights treaties. But they expanded the meaning of the Equal Rights Treaty to include equal pay for equal work and maternity legislation. And they called for labor legislation to be applied as well to domestic and rural workers. Their activism was meaningful. Feminists throughout the Americas used these international standards to pressure their own governments to enforce and implement maternity leave policies and to call for the vote. They also used the treaty to successfully push against proposed legislation that they deemed fascist. For instance, a proposed law in Chile that would have reduced women's minimum wages to 20% that of men's, and a proposed law in Argentina that would have reduced the status of married women to that of minors. They used the Equal Rights Treaty and their connections with each other to successfully push against these proposed pieces of legislation. I want to highlight the symbol of one of these groups, the Chilean anti-fascist feminist group founded in 1934, the Movimiento pro la Emancipación de la Mujer Chilena, or MEMCH. This was co-founded by Marta Vergara, a Chilean feminist who is also critical to expanding this inter-American feminist agenda. And this particular group grew to include several 100,000 women in Chile, including working and rural women. This image that features a picture of a woman holding a child while protesting and also demanding her autonomy illustrates the politics of Popular Front Pan-American feminism more broadly. This was a movement that specifically called for state-sponsored maternity leave and childcare as social rights and as human rights. At the same time, they called for women's equal political and civil rights and for access to legalized abortion and birth control. More broadly, they called for a society and a world that valued what we call today reproductive labor, the work that's necessary for the reproduction of human life, including not only having and raising children, but also making sure that communities are fed and cared for more generally. This kind of feminismo emphasized the interdependence of human beings, and that emphasis facilitated meaningful connections that they made between anti-colonial and anti-racist movements that were together demanding universal human rights in the late 1930s and 1940s. In fact, the very words that we today associate with international human rights, rights for all regardless of sex, race, class, or religion, were being articulated and demanded by anti-fascist feministas in these years. The Latin American feminists like Berta Lutz, Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic, and Amalia Castillo de Ledon from Mexico, who acted as delegates in the 1945 San Francisco conference, where they pushed women's rights and human rights into the UN Charter, were not leftists, although they did oppose fascism. They were acting as diplomats on behalf of their countries and were liberal feminists. But from the sidelines, Popular Front Pan-American feminists were directly pushing these women to implement these goals. And in order to insert women's rights into the UN Charter, these delegates were collaborating at the San Francisco conference with various religious and racial justice groups, from the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, a US group concerned for the rights of immigrants, to the NAACP, which was defining human rights around anti-racism and anti-colonialism, to groups defining human rights around anti-Semitism. Collaboration with all these groups was critical to getting human rights into the UN Charter. In the wake of that 1945 conference, Popular Front Pan-American feminists responded by interpreting the human rights promises and women's rights promises it made very broadly. They interpreted them as including not only women's political and civil rights, but also equal pay for equal work, maternity legislation, health care, the elimination of illegitimacy as a social indicator, and the eradication of racism and imperialism. And they looked forward to renewed organizing around these goals. Although the feminist activism around the UN Charter and the subsequent 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ongoing work of the Inter-American Commission of Women were critical to achieving women's suffrage in many countries in Latin America in the 1940s and 50s, the rise of the Cold War that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War dramatically narrowed the meanings of feminism and human rights and actually stifled activism around broader agendas. In the global contest between Western democracy and communism, feminism and human rights became defined, at least in the West, rather narrowly around individual rather than social and economic rights. Those understandings have endured, and they continue to shape our historical narratives, leaving us with the idea that global feminism's origins were in Western Europe, first world countries, and that it did not include meaningful participation of women from the global South until the 1970s. My book seeks to restore the longer transnational history of feminism and of the notion that women's rights are human rights. This idea did not, in fact, emerge from the United States or Western Europe, but from Latin American feministas enmeshed in regional conflicts over imperialism, fascism, and Pan-Americanism, and in collaboration with each other as well. The 6 feminists at the heart of my story helped build a blueprint for a movement that captured the energies of feministas throughout the hemisphere, who gave these words broad and revolutionary meaning. Their relationships with each other were testing grounds for the kind of politics they aspired to, one that, in Clara Gonzalez's words, should be a politic, quote, attuned to the real needs of modern life, which is a life of relationships, of interdependence, of solidarity, of mutual aid, of social action, and of love. Remembering those words and the movement that inspired them can help us broaden our understandings of feminism today and point us to new possibilities in the future. Thank you. So, if there are any questions, I think there are 2 microphones at either end of the...
So thank you for this groundbreaking book. Wow, I am super impressed. Would you elaborate? So the U.S. delegate Virginia Gildersleeve, she thought it was crass to actually suggest that women were discriminated against and that needed to be within the wording, right?
Right.
So how did Berta Lutz and the others, and I think there was a UK woman who also thought it was crass, right? So how did they convince the men to get it in? I think it's a miracle.
Yeah, thank you for that great question. So the question was about how, if these U.S. delegates and British delegates who are women were opposed to women's rights, how did it get into the UN Charter? Part of the answer is that Latin American women represented more delegates than any other group at the UN conference. In 1945, at the Chapultepec conference in Mexico City, leaders of the Inter-American Commission of Women, now Amalia Castillo de Ledon, the vice president, and Minerva Berdino from the Dominican Republic, who is the president, they insisted that Latin American countries send women as delegates to the UN conference. So you actually had a block there of Latin American women who were part of their national delegations and able to actually make policy. There were major groups of US women who were attending this conference, but aside from Virginia Gildersleeve, none of them were actually at the meeting tables and hammering out the details of this charter. The other point is that these feminists, as I mentioned, were working hand in hand with the NAACP and other non-governmental groups that were trying to insist that the United Nations Charter include commitments to human rights. And they were defining human rights broadly as inclusive of all those rights that I mentioned there. So they, inclusive of opposition to discrimination based on race, sex, religion. So all of these various groups who wanted some statement around human rights along those lines, they were all collaborating together to make that possible. They also were drawing on the fact that Latin American countries were feeling threatened at this moment that the UN was going to drown out the formerly strong Pan-American regional bloc that had existed before the United Nations now threatened to sort of crush that Pan-Americanism, that Pan-American regional solidarity and authority that they had. And so these Latin American feminists gained critical support from their various national delegations. They were also working with countries from at that conference, the big powers were really the powers most opposed to human rights being included in the charter. And so you actually had all of the, quote, smaller nations working together and banding together. In terms of the UN's Commission on the Status of Women that Berta Lutz proposed, she was working closely with Ramaswamy Mudaliar, a delegate, an Indian delegate, who worked on this with her. He was not one of the anti-colonial, there was a group of non-governmental people from India who were opposed to British colonialism. Ramaswamy Mudaliar had been appointed by the British, but he also was opposed to the veto system that was threatening that only the big powers would have any veto control over the UN. Berta Lutz was working on that with him, but they together were also pushing for the UN Commission on the Status of Women. I think it's hard to see how these women's rights guarantees and human rights emerged in the UN Charter without seeing the broader dynamics of great power hegemony that was emerging at this time in the UN and in its in the veto system, for instance, and in other areas. And so I think it's also not surprising that the women from the United States and Great Britain, from the great powers themselves, were opposed to these promises of human and women's rights. Thanks for that question.
I'd like to talk specifically about the momentum of the vote, and this year being specifically important. And you mentioned some things about colonial aspects of Latin America and where people were looking for support where they can find it. I guess the first question is, what country in Latin America would have the most support for those that would be looking for the vote? And then outside of that, from those where colonialism originated, I'm not really clear on this topic, but it looked like for women to get a non-restricted vote in Portugal, 1976 was when they received that, and in France it was 1946. So why were these things so late in Europe where they were occurring much more early in Latin America, if you can describe that?
That's a great question. And I actually have a slide that shows the Uruguayan feminist who I write about, Paulina Luisi. She created this map in 1929 to show the places where women had the right to vote and where they did not. And by this time, it was only Ecuador in Latin America in 1929 that had granted women the right to vote. In Latin America, the right to vote came from both what we would call, progressive governments that were being pushed by feminist movements, and also by, right-wing or dictatorships that were using women's rights as a way to promote the idea that they themselves were democratic. But in this period, Uruguay was actually a leader in promoting suffrage. It was in offing, it was being discussed as early as 1917, I believe, universal suffrage in Uruguay, and it didn't pass until 1932. But the real wave of suffrage in Latin America came after the Second World War. In Cuba, Brazil, and in Uruguay, it was passed in the 1930s, but it was really in the 40s and 50s, and especially after the UN's Charter and after the Declaration of Human Rights, that countries in Latin America began to pass suffrage in more sweeping ways. In terms of the specific histories around Portugal and France, I don't know those histories well enough to be able to provide an answer, but I think that often countries didn't pass women's suffrage unless they believed that their political parties were going to be aided by that, that political move. An interesting case is in Mexico in 1937. The Cardenas regime or presidency supported women's rights to vote, and it was even passed by both houses of Congress in Mexico, but it never actually gained an official stamp, and so it wasn't passed in Mexico until much later. At the same time, Mexican feminists were viewed as continental leftist Popular Front feminist leaders, and Cardenas's approval of suffrage in 1937 was used as sort of a way to mobilize a lot of these Popular Front feminist leaders that I'm talking about, who themselves were really pushing for suffrage in the late 30s and early 40s. So I think that each country has its own complicated history, but I really appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you for such an insightful talk. My question is, in your research, did you find any evidence that any intelligence agencies around the region, the Americas and Latin America, were conducting surveillance on any of these women?
Oh, that's a great question. I did Freedom of Information Acts for all of the women I write about, and the FBI was tracking Ofelia Dominguez Navarro from the 1940s at least through the 1950s. And so I know that Clara Gonzalez, when she actually visited the United States in the 50s, and she was interrogated when she was entering the country about her leftist commitments in the past. Both of these women, and Ofelia Dominguez Navarro was also basically detained for a number of days in Florida when she tried to come to the United States in the 50s as well, and was interrogated about her leftist commitments. And then I've actually done some research that shows that later, for instance, I found the Panama Canal Zone Army did a lot of surveillance on some of the Panamanian women who I write about, mostly later than the period that I'm looking at here. I think it really ratcheted up in the Cold War years after the Second World War. Does that answer your question? Or you?
Yeah, I just had a follow-up then, I guess, and maybe this is an opportunity for me to do more research, but I was just curious if they had been doing surveillance, if there was proof of any coordinated effort to undermine them in their work.
I don't know enough about whether they were, aside from detaining Dominguez, I don't know if they did much more to undermine her, but I would like to look into that. The Panamanian feminist I'm thinking of, Felicia Santizo, she was an Afro-Panamanian leader. She was a Communist Party leader in Panama. And the Canal Zone Army surveilled her for a very long time, and she actually left. She had to sort of leave Panama and live in Cuba. So I do think that they affected her organizing. Again, this is later, and it's not included in my book, but this was after the period that I'm talking about. So
thank you.
Thank you for that question. I should also mention that after Doris Stevens was ousted as the head of the commission in 1938, there was an odd bedfellow alliance between some Popular Front Pan-American feminists from Mexico and the U.S. State Department, actually. The U.S. State Department played an instrumental role in pushing Doris Stevens out of her role as commissioner because she had been a huge thorn in the side of the U.S. State Department at all of these Pan-American conferences. And so after that time, the U.S. State Department actually then controlled the commission. It officially became a more official part of the Pan-American Union. And the State Department had more of a say over who was officially involved in it. And so there was a way in which it became utilized during the Second World War as part of the U.S. government's broader Pan-American effort to sort of ratchet up support for the U.S. war effort. But at the same time, Latin American feminists kept pushing their own agenda, which usually privileged a broader women's rights agenda and promotion of this women's rights treaty that they had worked so long and hard for. Thank you. Thanks so much. It was a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Folks, just a reminder, there is a book signing one level up in the Archives bookstore. This is Katherine's first stop on her book tour, so you definitely want to get a copy.